Everybody sees the world differently. That's just the way of it. Whether it's our worldview, the information available, or just how our brains are hardwired, every single person sees things differently. And as I got into in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, this can sometimes cause two different people to see the same thing totally opposite to each other. Because as I got into in that video, the thing in question is exactly the same, but to two different individuals, it can mean something completely different because of the perspective they have on it. In other words, the only thing that's different is how the two people view it. And there are many movies out there that actually take advantage of this aspect of human nature to tell some very unique and sometimes horrifying stories. And today, I'd like to go over some of the movies that best utilize perspective to have the audience see things through the point of view of characters versus how they actually are. And as I always note, there will be spoilers for anything I bring up ahead. So in case there's something you don't want ruined, I would highly advise you stay on the lookout. You have been warned. Okay, so obviously one of the most well-known uses of character perspective comes in the form of the unreliable narrator, which is basically when a character is narrating the story from their point of view, but either because their own words betray them or more accurate information is provided later, it calls into question just how much of the narrator's story is accurate. And, of course, one of the most famous examples to utilize this is The Usual Suspects. Since verbal Kint turns out to be Kaiser Sose, it makes one wonder how much, if anything, he told the police detective was actually true. Because the only thing the audience knows with absolute certainty to have played out the way it's shown is Keating's death. Because that's the only thing shown independently of his perspective. However, what makes this case unique among unreliable narrators is that the character in question is deliberately telling a false version of the story on purpose, rather than because they genuinely believe that's how events played out. For example, we know that all the names and descriptions he gives are fake, as well as quite a few locations, but how many of the interactions between the characters were real or made up is a lot more up in the air, because in many cases he would have nothing to gain from altering them. But on the other hand, the whole story could be completely fictitious and we'll never know. The point is, the audience is only told a single character's perspective on what happened, and because it's known he was deliberately altering facts, one can only try and piece together the truth based off his story and the facts that are known. So as a result, what actually happened is a total mystery. But for a more accurate example of an unreliable narrator, there's also the works of Edgar Allan Poe, who was notably a big fan of the concept. For example, in his story The Telltale Heart, the narrator repeatedly insists he's not mad, aka insane, and tells the story in order to prove their point. However, in doing so, he reveals himself to be a complete monomaniac, aka a person suffering from a disorder where they develop a single-minded, all-consuming obsession with something, as he stands motionless in doorways for hours on end and believes that murder is the only solution because an old man that basically takes care of him has a deformed eye that drives him crazy. To put it simply, the narrator insists they aren't crazy, but all their actions show otherwise. And not to mention, There's also the fact that the narrator claims towards the end that the police are just sitting there having tea while he suffers a complete mental breakdown, which many scholars have doubted actually played out that way. Because many experts, which I most certainly am not, have called into question just how oblivious the police actually were to the fact that the narrator was going to snap, or if there might have been some words between them that he conveniently leaves out. The point is, it's quite obvious you can't believe everything the narrator claims. Or for a more subtle example, there's also Poe's story, The Black Cat, which tells the story of an unnamed narrator who was a caring animal lover until he became an alcoholic. Now, while it's generally agreed that most of his story is accurate, there is one aspect to it that many have questioned, which is that the narrator has a pet cat named Pluto, whom he eventually stabs in the eye and hangs from a noose. And later on, he encounters another cat that looks identical to Pluto, including that it only has one eye, other than a white patch on his chest, which the narrator eventually realizes resembles a gallows. This then causes the narrator to believe this cat is Pluto back from the dead and starts to hate him because of it. Now, while his description of the cat could be totally accurate, some scholars have put forth the theory that the narrator, in his drunken guilt, simply imagined all of the cat's similarities to Pluto and that it actually looks nothing like how he describes it, which is only further backed up by the narrator repeatedly suffering from hallucinations throughout the story. But in the end, it doesn't really matter because the only important thing is how the cat looks to the narrator, as his apparent resemblance to Pluto and his beliefs regarding it heavily influence the outcome of the story. So in this case, the truth is irrelevant because the character's perspective on what the cat's appearance is, whether it's accurate or not, is what's important. And that's the brilliance of it. The fact that in order for the reader to understand why events played out the way they do, they must see it through the narrator's point of view. And whether or not that perspective is correct or not doesn't matter, because to him, that's what the cat looks like. And honestly, that's how many real-life crimes have also been committed. The truth is irrelevant because it's only the criminal's perspective of events that caused them to play out the way they did. But to move away from the unreliable narrator, the point is that the perspective of a character has on something and how those events actually play out aren't always the same. But perhaps one of the most unique movies to show this would be Memento. Because let's face it, a person who can only remember things for a couple of minutes before completely forgetting everything can be a very hard thing to grasp. So that's why the movie is mostly told backwards, so the audience can get the best idea of what his life is actually like. And to put it simply, it's pretty dang confusing. But either way, in this case, telling the story that way is necessary because Christopher Nolan wants the audience to be able to understand what this character's life is like. So as a result, he tells it from his perspective in order for them to grasp that in the best way possible. But there's also an extra layer of perspective thrown in because it also turns out he's an unreliable narrator as well. To put it simply, Memento is just rife for character perspectives. It's what makes up the entire movie, up to and including the fact that several characters manipulate Leonard into seeing things that are convenient for them, up to and including himself. Basically, A person's perspective on things is what makes up their life, and Memento shows what happens when a character is unable to form any long-lasting perspective on anything. And when he learns the truth that his quest for his wife's killer is a sham, he chooses to forget it because he'd rather have a purpose, any purpose, than end up a vegetable in a mental institution. In other words, this is a man who knows he has no future, and based off the way we're able to see how his life works, that isn't inaccurate. So he'd rather manipulate himself into chasing random criminals than accept the truth. Honestly, if one wants to get a handle on different character perspectives and how to present them on film, this would be the perfect movie to watch. Because as I said before, the way it's used by both the narrative and characters is not only genius, but everywhere. The way the world really is, and the way Leonard sees it, and the way the audience views it, are all 100 different things throughout the movie due to countless factors. And it's only at the very end that things finally align for just a few minutes. Because the thing here is, the way a writer uses a character's perspective on any given thing is often done to show the audience how they think something is and whether or not it's accurate to how that thing really is. To put it simply, a character's perspective can reveal more about them than anything else in the narrative. And going back to Memento, it does such a good job of showing things from Leonard's perspective that the audience can completely understand him and his motivations by the time it's over. Sometimes, two people see things from a different angle, and it's only by being able to see it from the other angle that you can fully understand what the other person is thinking in regards to it. That's even where the whole phrase point of view comes from, because it doesn't just refer to what is physically seen, but how we perceive things as well. But that being said, that's not to say that the concept of perspective itself can't be interesting even aside from the characters involved. In fact, that's why the famous question of whether or not Hobbes was alive in the famous comic strip Calvin and Hobbes was never answered. Because to the strip's creator and writer Bill Watterson, it was never about that. To him, everything regarding Hobbes and his influence on the world or lack thereof all comes down to perspective. Because to Calvin, Hobbes is real, a breathing friend, while to everybody else, he's just a stuffed tiger. And because nobody's perspective changes, no evidence to support either interpretation ever alters what the other person sees. So once again, that's why Watterson has never answered that faithful question and even gets annoyed when asked it. Because to him, the true answer is that to Calvin, he is real, and to others, he's a stuffed tiger. It's not about who's right, it's about what each given character believes, and that they see the same thing differently. But this also applied to many things that happened in individual strips as well. For example, there's a famous series of strips where Calvin believes he's been turned into an owl, and for the most part he's shown as such. Except for one strip where he goes and tells his mom about it, where he's shown to be his regular old self, and she only, quote, knows he's an owl because he tells her. Then in the next panel, he goes right back to being an owl again. Now, while most would argue that the strip proves Calvin was just imagining it, Watterson would instead say that he was simply showing that from Calvin's perspective, he was an owl, while from his mother's perspective, he was just himself, and that neither interpretation is wrong because that's how they both individually see it. But on the flip side, there are times where one person, usually Calvin's, perspective is shown to be unambiguously wrong, but that's usually reserved for his much more improbable scenarios. And there's also the fact that Watterson has never argued that just because two people have different perspectives on something, that doesn't mean one of them isn't wrong. Just that he's not really interested in exploring who was right when it comes to things like if Hobbes was real or not. Because in that case, it's all about perspective. So who's right depends entirely on whose point of view you're seeing it from. In fact, Watterson's interest in individual people's perspectives also majorly influenced how certain things played out regarding the strip. For example, he was eventually going to reveal what the infamous noodle incident actually was, but figured that all the readers out there could come up with something better than he could, and moreover, it would be what they would find the most funny. After all, everybody does have a different sense of humor, so they'd naturally come up with whatever they thought was funny. But where this really influenced him was in his refusal to merchandise and expand the brand. Because on top of Watterson just being the type of person who wasn't interested in being famous and wanted the comic strip to maintain its purity, he also wanted to maintain the illusion everybody had of the strip. Because he knew everybody would imagine different voices for the characters, different subtle mannerisms that he couldn't draw, and all the other things that he didn't or couldn't personally put into the strip. And unlike so many creators who want to mold their work to their vision before anything else, and not unrightfully so, Watterson wanted to maintain everybody's different illusion of what the strip meant to them. Because, as I just noted, many would argue that since Bill Watterson was the creator of the comic strip, his perspective is the correct one. How he hears the characters, what their mannerisms would be, and all that other unseen stuff. But just like with Hobbes, that's not how Watterson views it. Believing in death of the author to such a degree that he sees his own perspective as just another one of millions who have read the strip. And in order to preserve everybody's individual perspective on it, among many other reasons, don't get me wrong, Watterson turned down a fortune in merchandising revenue. Basically, even if he has nothing to do with movies, Bill Watterson and Calvin and Hobbes is a great, very interesting and educational look at individual and character perspectives, if only because he had taken it to levels most would never even think of. Okay, so the point here is how the world actually looks and how any given person may see it can be two very different things, and many movies take advantage of that discrepancy in order to either help the audience understand characters better or even make them question everything they just saw. But as quite a few of the examples I brought up hopefully demonstrated, when it's done right, the result can absolutely blow the audience away, as the long-term success of both those movies and comic strip have proven. But what's also important to remember in regards to all of this is that if one wants to show something from a character's perspective, there has to be something about it to show. It doesn't have to be much, but ultimately there has to be some reason to show things from any given point of view. Alright, I think that's everything I had to say on that. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that character perspectives are one of the best and most unique tools a writer can use in any given story? Or do you believe a narrative is better when it's as straightforward as possible and the individual character's point of view is only stated, not actually shown? Please let me know in the comments below. And please note that you do not have to agree with this video if you don't want to. You are absolutely entitled to your own opinion or perspective on it, and if you happen to think I'm wrong, that's completely okay. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.